Some people wear a badge because they believe in justice. Others wear it because the badge gives them something they could never earn on their own, the illusion of power. And when authority becomes a tool for ego instead of service, it only takes one wrong decision for that illusion to shatter. The fastest way to destroy a career is to mistake authority for justice. Those words would echo through the halls of the Fulton Federal Courthouse long after the handcuffs came off. But on that crisp Monday morning, Officer Daniel Hayes had no reason to believe the man standing quietly before him would become the turning point of his entire life. The courthouse plaza buzzed with the familiar rhythm of downtown Atlanta as attorneys hurried through security carrying leather briefcases. Reporters adjusted camera equipment near the front steps, and federal employees exchanged quick greetings before disappearing behind the towering glass doors. American flags moved gently in the early breeze while the marble columns reflected the first warm rays of sunlight, giving the building the appearance of absolute order. To most people, it was simply another workday. To one man, it would become the day everything unraveled. Daniel Hayes adjusted the radio clip to his uniform and scanned the crowd with practiced confidence. After nearly 12 years on the force, he trusted his instincts more than procedures, believing experience allowed him to recognize trouble long before anyone else. His supervisors often praised his decisiveness, though they quietly ignored the growing number of complaints describing him as impatient, dismissive, and too eager to assume the worst. None of those complaints had ever slowed his career, reinforcing the belief that he could never truly be wrong. Just beyond the security checkpoint, a tall black man in a tailored charcoal suit walked calmly toward the entrance carrying a worn leather portfolio. His silver tie was neatly centered. His polished shoes reflected the morning light, and every movement carried quiet confidence rather than urgency. His name was Judge Isaiah Brooks, though almost no one outside the federal judiciary would recognize him without his black judicial robe. Today, he intentionally looked like any other professional arriving for work because he was participating in a confidential review of courthouse security procedures after several reports alleging improper conduct by law enforcement officers assigned to the building. Only a handful of senior officials knew why he had chosen to arrive without ceremony. Isaiah paused briefly to greet an elderly courthouse volunteer who smiled warmly before continuing inside, completely unaware that several pairs of eyes had already begun following him. Daniel noticed the portfolio first, then the calm expression that somehow irritated him more than it should have. Confidence, without explanation, often invited suspicion in his mind. As Isaiah reached into his jacket to retrieve his courthouse credentials, Daniel stepped directly into his path. "Hold it right there," he said firmly, extending one hand. Conversations nearby slowed. Several people instinctively looked toward the entrance. Isaiah met the officer's eyes without the slightest sign of fear or frustration. His voice remained measured. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Daniel ignored the question. "Set the portfolio down and keep your hand where I can see them." A quiet silence spread across the marble entrance as attorneys, clerks, and visitors exchanged uncertain glances. Isaiah complied without hesitation, placing the portfolio gently on the ground before folding his hands in front of him. There was no argument, no raised voice, only remarkable patience. Daniel interpreted that composure as calculation rather than dignity. He leaned forward slightly, convinced he had already figured out exactly who this man was. What he never considered was that the calm standing in front of him did not belong to someone hiding from a law. It belonged to someone who had spent an entire career protecting it. Daniel kept his hand raised, silently ordering everyone around him to remain exactly where they were. The conversations that had filled the courthouse entrance only moments earlier faded into cautious whispers as people sensed that something unusual was unfolding. A young attorney slowed his pace. While checking his watch, unsure whether to continue inside or stay where he was. Two deputy clerks exchanged uncertain glances before quietly stepping aside. Even the security officers stationed near the metal detectors watched from a distance, trusting that Daniel knew what he was doing. He certainly believed he did. Years of wearing the uniform had convinced him that hesitation invited weakness, and weakness invited disrespect. In his mind, confidence alone was enough to establish authority. Isaiah Brooks remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He had spent decades inside courtrooms where emotions often decided outcomes long before facts ever had a chance to speak. Experience had taught him that remaining calm could reveal more about another person's character than any argument ever could. He slowly removed one hand from his jacket pocket, revealing nothing more than a folded pair of reading glasses. Daniel watched every movement with growing suspicion. "I asked for identification," he said in a firmer tone. "You reached into your jacket anyway." Isaiah nodded politely. "I was retrieving my courthouse credentials, officer." Daniel extended his hand. "Then hand them to me." Isaiah reached for the identification holder attached inside his suit coat and carefully presented it without stepping forward. Before even reading the card, Daniel glanced briefly at the photograph and gave a skeptical smile. "Nice try." Isaiah remained composed. "There is no need for this to become more complicated than it already is." Daniel barely listened. His attention had already shifted from verifying information to confirming the story he had created in his own mind. He turned the identification card over twice before shaking his head. Anyone can make something that looks official these days. Several people standing nearby exchanged uneasy looks. A courthouse receptionist recognized Isaiah almost immediately. She took a hesitant step forward. "Officer, I believe." Daniel interrupted without looking at her. "Ma'am, this does not concern you." The receptionist stopped speaking, visibly uncomfortable. Isaiah noticed her hesitation and offered the slightest reassuring nod, silently asking her not to escalate the situation. He understood something Daniel did not. Every decision made in public carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment itself. Across the plaza, a courthouse maintenance supervisor paused while unlocking a service entrance. He looked toward Isaiah with obvious recognition before reaching for his phone. Inside the building, an elevator quietly opened as several federal employees stepped into the lobby, unaware that events outside were beginning to draw attention from multiple security cameras positioned above the entrance. Every angle of the interaction was being recorded without interruption. Daniel folded Isaiah's credentials and slipped them into one of his own pockets instead of returning them. "Until I know exactly who you are," he said, "you are staying right here." Isaiah met his eyes with the same measured calm that had never left him since the encounter began. "Officer Hayes," he said softly after reading the names stitched across the uniform. "There is still time to verify the facts before making a decision that cannot easily be undone." Daniel frowned. The confidence in Isaiah's voice felt strangely unsettling. Most people confronted by law enforcement either became defensive or anxious. This man had done neither. His composure felt almost impossible to explain. Daniel interpreted it as arrogance instead of restraint. Without realizing it, he had stopped investigating a situation and had started defending his own assumptions. And inside the courthouse, people who understood exactly who Isaiah Brooks was had already begun moving toward the entrance. The growing crowd outside the courthouse did not realize they were witnessing something far more revealing than a disagreement at a security checkpoint. They were watching two completely different ideas of authority stand face to face. One relied on unquestioned power. The other relied on patience, discipline, and the certainty that truth never needed to raise its voice. Daniel Hayes looked around and noticed more people had stopped walking. Instead of making him reconsider, the attention strengthened his determination. In his experience, backing away in front of a crowd looked like weakness, and weakness was something he refused to display. He straightened his shoulders and spoke louder than necessary. "You are refusing to cooperate with a lawful investigation." Isaiah Brooks answered with the same calm expression. "Officer, I have cooperated with every instruction you have given. I presented identification. I have remained exactly where you asked me to stand. I have answered every question respectfully." Daniel crossed his arms. "That is not for you to decide." Isaiah nodded once. No, it is not. The brief answer unsettled Daniel more than any argument could have. There was no challenge in Isaiah's voice, no trace of sarcasm, only quiet confidence. It was the kind of confidence that came from someone who did not need to prove anything. A young law student standing near the courthouse steps whispered to her professor, "That man has not done anything wrong." The professor did not answer immediately. Instead, he watched Daniel carefully before saying, "Sometimes the most important evidence is not what people say. It is how they choose to use the authority they have." Daniel reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need assistance at the main entrance." A calm voice answered through the speaker. "Copy that. What is the nature of the situation?" Daniel kept his eyes on Isaiah. "Possible fraudulent identification. Individual is refusing to provide verifiable credentials." Isaiah listened without interrupting. The statement was inaccurate, but correcting it would accomplish nothing. He understood that once someone became committed to a conclusion, facts alone rarely changed their mind. They needed time to confront those facts themselves. Several courthouse employees quietly exchanged concerned looks. One senior clerk hurried back inside without saying a word. Another employee reached the administrative office and calmly informed the duty supervisor that Judge Isaiah Brooks had been delayed at the entrance by an officer who appeared unaware of his identity. Inside the building, the atmosphere changed almost instantly. Phones began ringing between offices. A United States Marshal supervisor looked toward the security monitors displaying the courthouse entrance. The screen showed Isaiah standing peacefully with his hands visible while Officer Hayes continued questioning him. The supervisor frowned. "How long has this been happening?" "Just a few minutes," another employee answered. "But it is getting more attention outside." Back at the entrance, Daniel took one step closer. "Tell me exactly why you are here today." Isaiah answered without hesitation. "I have official business inside this courthouse." "Doing what?" Daniel asked. Isaiah paused briefly before replying. "The details of my schedule are not something I discuss publicly." Daniel interpreted the answer as further proof that he was hiding something. Convenient answer. Isaiah simply looked toward the courthouse doors for a brief moment before returning his attention to Daniel. "Officer Hayes, every public servant eventually faces a moment when a single decision defines how others will remember them. I sincerely hope this is not that moment for you." Daniel almost laughed. "You are in no position to give me advice." Isaiah did not respond. He had already noticed something Daniel had not. Reflected in the courthouse glass behind the officer were several figures moving quickly toward the entrance, their pace steady, their expression serious. And each passing second brought the truth closer than either man could yet see. The air outside the courthouse felt noticeably heavier as more people gathered near the entrance, each one sensing that an ordinary security check had quietly transformed into something far more significant. Some watched with concern. Others simply slowed their pace, uncertain whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or the beginning of a serious mistake. Daniel Hayes, however, interpreted every curious glance as confirmation that he was in control. The larger the audience became, the more determined he was to prove that his judgment could not be questioned. He reached toward the leather portfolio resting on the ground and carefully opened it without asking another question. Inside were neatly organized legal documents, a notebook filled with handwritten observations, and several folders bearing official federal court markings. Daniel glanced through them quickly, but dismissed what he saw almost immediately. "These could belong to anyone," he said. Isaiah Brooks remained composed. "Those materials belong exactly where they are." Daniel ignored the response and continued searching. He found business cards identifying senior court officials, confidential scheduling documents, and a courthouse access badge attached to a security lanyard. Instead of considering that the evidence supported Isaiah's explanation, Daniel convinced himself that the documents only made the situation appear more suspicious. In his mind, someone carrying convincing credentials could simply be trying harder to deceive people. Confirmation bias had quietly replaced objective judgment. A middle-aged attorney, standing nearby, finally stepped forward with visible hesitation. "Officer," he said respectfully, "I believe I recognize that gentleman. I have seen him inside this courthouse many times." Daniel did not even look in his direction. "Sir, I did not ask for your opinion." The attorney immediately stepped back, recognizing that continuing the conversation would only make matters worse. Isaiah observed the exchange without satisfaction or frustration. He understood that every unnecessary interruption would only increase Daniel's determination to defend his original assumption. Sometimes the hardest part of protecting justice was allowing another person enough space to reveal their own conduct. Daniel removed a small pair of reading glasses from the portfolio before placing them back inside. He closed the case and looked directly at Isaiah. "I still do not know who you really are." Isaiah answered quietly. "Everything you need to know has already been placed in front of you." Those words lingered for a moment before disappearing into the growing silence surrounding them. Nearby, two television reporters preparing for an unrelated courthouse story noticed the unusual gathering and slowly turned one of their cameras toward the entrance. They were not recording the confrontation itself, but they sensed an important public event might be developing. Across the plaza, another patrol officer arrived after hearing Daniel's radio request. He approached calmly before speaking in a lower voice. "Daniel, what do we have?" Daniel answered confidently. "Possible impersonation involving federal identification." The second officer looked briefly toward Isaiah, whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding him. "Has dispatch confirmed anything yet?" Daniel shook his head, still waiting. The officer nodded, but said nothing further. Something about the situation felt incomplete. Isaiah stood exactly where he had been instructed from the beginning, making no attempt to leave, no attempt to argue, and no attempt to persuade anyone of his identity beyond the documents he had already provided. It was behavior that did not match the assumptions Daniel continued to make. Inside the courthouse, the elevator doors opened onto the main lobby. A senior United States Marshals supervisor stepped out alongside the chief court administrator and two experienced deputy marshals. Their pace was steady but purposeful as they moved directly toward the front entrance after confirming the live security camera feed. Outside, Daniel had no idea they were less than 100 feet away. He folded his arms once more and looked directly at Isaiah. "Until I decide otherwise, you're not going anywhere." Isaiah's expression never changed. He simply glanced beyond Daniel's shoulder for the briefest moment before calmly replying, "Officer Hayes, I do not believe that decision belongs to you anymore." The courthouse doors opened with quiet precision, and the atmosphere shifted before a single word was spoken. Conversation stopped. Several employees standing near the entrance instinctively stepped aside as three United States deputy marshals, followed by Chief Court Administrator Rebecca Collins, walked across the marble floor toward the growing crowd. Their expressions were calm, but their pace carried unmistakable purpose. Daniel Hayes noticed them immediately. Instead of questioning why senior federal officials were approaching, he assumed they had arrived to support his decision. Confidence settled across his face as he turned slightly toward them. "Perfect timing," he said. "I have an individual using questionable federal credentials." Rebecca Collins did not answer him. Her attention moved directly to Isaiah Brooks. "Good morning, Judge Brooks," she said respectfully. "I sincerely apologize for the delay." The words seemed to freeze the air itself. Several people standing nearby exchanged stunned looks. One attorney slowly removed his glasses as if he believed he had misheard. The second patrol officer beside Daniel looked from Rebecca to Isaiah and then back to Daniel without saying a word. Daniel stared at Rebecca in disbelief. "Judge?" he asked. Rebecca nodded without hesitation. "Federal Judge Isaiah Brooks." Daniel gave a short laugh, convinced there had been some mistake. There has to be some confusion. His identification could not be verified. One of the deputy marshals stepped forward calmly. "His credentials were verified before we exited the lobby. They have been active for years." Daniel's expression tightened. He never identified himself. Isaiah spoke for the first time since the officials arrived. His voice remained exactly as calm as it had been from the beginning. "Officer Hayes, I presented my credentials when you requested them. You chose not to accept them. No accusation." No anger. Only a simple statement of fact. Rebecca turned toward Daniel with measured professionalism. May I have Judge Brooks's identification returned, please? Daniel hesitated for the first time that morning. His hand slowly reached into his uniform pocket before removing the identification holder he had kept. Rebecca accepted it carefully before handing it back to Isaiah with both hands. Thank you for your patience, Your Honor. Isaiah offered a polite nod. Thank you, Ms. Collins. Around them, the silence became almost overwhelming. The people who had witnessed the entire exchange now understood exactly what had happened. The courthouse receptionist lowered her eyes with visible relief. The attorney who had tried to intervene earlier quietly exhaled. Even the television crew standing across the plaza recognized that they had just witnessed an extraordinary public mistake. Daniel searched for something that would restore control over the situation. If he's a federal judge, he said, why was he dressed like this? Why did nobody tell us? One of the deputy marshals answered evenly. Judge Brooks was participating in an administrative review approved by the chief judge. His attire was intentional. His authority does not depend on a robe, and his identity does not disappear because he is wearing a business suit. Those words landed harder than anyone expected. Daniel suddenly became aware of every security camera mounted above the entrance, every witness surrounding the plaza, every conversation that had quietly stopped to observe his decisions. For the first time since the encounter began, certainty gave way to doubt. Isaiah looked at Daniel without satisfaction or resentment. Officer Hayes, he said gently, every public servant is trusted with discretion. The law expects us to verify before we judge, because assumptions can damage lives far more quickly than facts can repair them. No one spoke after that. The lesson required no further explanation. Yet inside the courthouse, another meeting had already begun, and the security footage from every camera, along with the complete body camera recording, was already being preserved for formal review. Daniel Hayes stood motionless as the reality of the past several minutes settled over the courthouse entrance. The confidence that had guided every decision now felt strangely distant, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that no explanation could immediately erase. Around him, people slowly resumed moving, but they did so differently than before. The hurried footsteps had become cautious. Quiet conversations replaced curious whispers. Every witness understood they had observed more than a misunderstanding. They had witnessed the consequences of assumptions replacing careful judgment. Judge Isaiah Brooks accepted his identification holder from Rebecca Collins and carefully returned it to the inside pocket of his suit jacket. His movements remained steady, never hurried, never theatrical. He did not look like a man interested in proving someone wrong. He looked like a man preparing to continue. The work he had arrived to perform before his morning had been unexpectedly interrupted. Rebecca glanced toward one of the deputy marshals. Please ensure every camera recording from the entrance is secured immediately, she said. Include all surveillance footage and all associated body camera recordings. The deputy marshal nodded. Already in progress. Daniel heard every word. He understood exactly what that meant. Nothing that had happened would disappear into conflicting memories or uncertain testimony. Every instruction, every response, every opportunity to verify the facts had been preserved exactly as it occurred. The second patrol officer quietly stepped closer to Daniel. His voice remained respectful, but noticeably lower than before. Daniel, perhaps we should let the administrative review continue. Daniel answered without taking his eyes off Isaiah. I was following procedure. The officer hesitated before replying. Procedure also includes verification. The sentence was brief, but it carried more weight than Daniel expected. Inside the courthouse conference room overlooking the main lobby, several senior officials had already assembled. Large monitors displayed synchronized views from multiple security cameras positioned throughout the entrance plaza. Another screen showed the complete body camera recording beginning from a moment Daniel first approached Isaiah. Timestamps aligned every angle with remarkable precision. No one spoke while the recordings played. They simply watched the sequence unfold exactly as it had happened, allowing the evidence to speak without interruption. Judge Brooks finally turned toward Rebecca. "Shall we continue with today's review?" Rebecca looked almost surprised by the question. "Your Honor, after everything that has happened this morning, you still wish to proceed?" Isaiah offered a small, thoughtful smile. The purpose of today's review was to evaluate professional judgment under ordinary circumstances. It appears the process has become unexpectedly thorough. Rebecca nodded with quiet understanding. She had worked with Judge Brooks for years and knew his greatest strength had never been authority. It was consistency. He believed the integrity of the justice system depended upon treating uncomfortable truths the same way it treated comfortable ones. Outside, Daniel watched Isaiah prepare to enter the courthouse. For the first time since the encounter began, he spoke without confidence. "Judge Brooks." Isaiah paused and turned. Daniel struggled to find the words. Every sentence he considered sounded incomplete. Finally, he said, "I believed I was doing my job." Isaiah studied him for a brief moment before answering calmly. "Doing your job begins with respecting the facts, Officer Hayes. Authority should never move faster than evidence." The words were neither harsh nor forgiving. They were simply true. Isaiah then entered the courthouse alongside the federal officials, disappearing beyond the glass doors he had attempted to reach nearly half an hour earlier. Daniel remained outside, watching the entrance close behind them. For the first time in many years, the weight on his shoulders did not come from wearing a badge. It came from recognizing that every decision made under its authority had now become part of an official record that others would examine with the same patience and objectivity he had failed to show that morning. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside the Fulton Federal Courthouse had returned to its familiar rhythm, but behind closed doors, the morning's events had already become the center of an official administrative review. In a secure conference room, senior court officials, representatives from the United States Marshal Service, and command staff from the local police department sat around a polished oak table facing a large display screen. No one entered the room with conclusions already written. Every person present understood that accountability within the justice system depended on facts rather than assumptions. One by one, the recordings began to play. The first camera showed Daniel Hayes approaching Judge Isaiah Brooks before any conversation had taken place. Another angle captured the reactions of courthouse employees as the encounter unfolded. The body camera recording added every spoken word with remarkable clarity. No one interrupted the playback. They watched the complete interaction exactly as it had happened, from the first request for identification to the final moment when federal officials confirmed Isaiah's identity. When the recordings ended, the room remained silent for several long seconds. Chief Court Administrator Rebecca Collins quietly placed a folder on the conference table. The security review scheduled for today was intended to evaluate how authority is exercised under ordinary circumstances, she said. Instead, it documented an actual event that requires administrative evaluation. A representative from the United States Marshal Service nodded. Judge Brooks followed every instruction. He remained cooperative throughout the encounter. There was no indication of resistance or interference. The internal affairs captain from the police department leaned forward while reviewing his notes. The concern is not simply the initial stop. Officers make difficult decisions every day. The concern is what happened after valid identification was presented and multiple opportunities existed to verify the information before escalating the situation. Across the table, Daniel Hayes listened without attempting to interrupt. The confidence that had once shaped every answer was gone. He watched portions of his own body camera recording replay on the monitor and noticed details he had completely overlooked in the moment. Isaiah had answered every question respectfully. He had never raised his voice. He had never refused instructions. Several witnesses had attempted to clarify the situation, and each opportunity to slow down and verify the facts had been dismissed. Daniel realized that the evidence was not revealing something new. It was simply allowing him to see his own decisions without emotion clouding his judgment. Judge Brooks had not requested to attend the review, but after being invited to provide a factual statement, he entered the conference room with the same quiet professionalism he had displayed all morning. Every person present stood briefly as he entered before returning to their seats. Isaiah thanked them and remained standing rather than taking a place at the table. "I'm not here to recommend punishment," he said calmly. "That responsibility belongs to the appropriate administrative process. I am here because public trust depends upon every institution holding itself to the same standard it asks of the people it serves." The room remained completely still. Isaiah continued, "Every officer carries significant responsibility. Every judge carries significant responsibility. Neither position exists to elevate the individual. Both exist to protect the public through fairness, restraint, and respect for the law. When any of us allows assumptions to replace verification, confidence in the entire system is weakened." Those words settled over the room with unmistakable weight. They were not spoken with anger or satisfaction. They reflected decades spent understanding that justice was strongest when it remained impartial. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes toward the conference table. For the first time in his career, he fully understood that the most difficult part of accountability was not facing criticism from others. It was recognizing the moment when the evidence left no room to defend the person you believed yourself to be. The review concluded before the end of the business day, but its impact was only beginning. By late afternoon, the findings had already moved through the formal administrative process, supported by surveillance footage, body camera recordings, written witness statements, and verified courthouse records. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The issue had never been the initial decision to approach a citizen. The issue was the repeated choice to ignore opportunities to verify the truth after credible information had been presented. Inside police headquarters, Daniel Hayes sat quietly across from Deputy Chief Laura Mitchell, the Internal Affairs Captain, and a representative from the city's Professional Standards Division. A neatly organized case file rested on the table between them. Deputy Chief Mitchell spoke first, her voice steady and professional. "Officer Hayes, this review is not based on public opinion or media attention. It is based entirely on documented evidence and departmental policy." Daniel nodded slowly. He had already watched the recordings himself several times. Each viewing made it harder to recognize the officer he believed he had been that morning. Every interruption, every dismissed explanation, every assumption now appeared more obvious than it had felt in the moment. The Internal Affairs Captain opened the folder. The investigation determined that established verification procedures were not followed despite multiple opportunities to confirm identity through available channels. Those decisions unnecessarily escalated a situation that could have been resolved within minutes. Daniel listened without attempting to argue. He knew the report accurately reflected what had happened. The evidence required no interpretation. It simply existed. Deputy Chief Mitchell continued, "Effective immediately, you are being relieved of active duty pending final administrative action. Your department credentials, badge, and service equipment will be processed according to departmental procedure." The words were delivered without anger or satisfaction. They represented accountability rather than punishment. Daniel slowly removed the polished badge from his uniform and placed it carefully on the conference table. For more than a decade, it had represented pride, responsibility, and purpose. Looking at it now, he understood that the badge itself had never guaranteed integrity. It only symbolized the public trust placed in the person wearing it. Once that trust was damaged, the medal carried no authority on its own. Across town, Judge Isaiah Brooks completed the final hearing on his calendar before returning to his chambers. His judicial assistant quietly informed him that the administrative process had reached its initial conclusion. Isaiah simply nodded before placing another case file on his desk. There was no celebration, no expression of personal victory. His attention had already returned to the next matter waiting before the court because justice, in his view, could never become personal. It had to remain consistent regardless of who stood before it. Before leaving for the evening, Rebecca Collins entered Isaiah's office, carrying a copy of the completed security review. The recommendations include additional training for courthouse law enforcement partners, expanded verification protocols, and updated communication procedures. Isaiah smiled faintly. Then perhaps something constructive can still come from today. Rebecca nodded. That was your hope from the beginning, was not it? Isaiah looked toward the courthouse window, where the evening sun reflected across the city skyline. Accountability should improve institutions, not simply embarrass individuals. As daylight faded outside, Daniel quietly walked out of police headquarters, carrying a small cardboard box containing family photographs, a coffee mug, and a few personal belongings collected from his locker. No reporters waited outside. No crowd gathered to watch him leave. The moment was quiet, almost ordinary. Yet the silence carried a lesson that would remain long after the paperwork was complete. A career had not been undone by one difficult encounter alone. It had been undone by the repeated decision to let certainty speak before the facts had been given the chance to be heard. Several weeks later, the morning sun once again illuminated the marble entrance of the Fulton Federal Courthouse. The same American flag moved gently above the front steps. Attorneys hurried through the security checkpoint carrying briefcases. Court employees greeted one another with familiar smiles. Visitors waited patiently for their hearings to begin. At first glance, nothing appeared different, yet those who had witnessed the events of that unforgettable Monday knew the building had quietly changed. New verification procedures had been implemented. Additional training emphasized communication before conclusion, confirmation before accusation, and professionalism before pride. The lesson had extended far beyond a single officer or a single courthouse. It had become part of the institution itself. Judge Isaiah Brooks walked through the entrance wearing his judicial robe, acknowledging courthouse staff with the same calm courtesy he had shown every day throughout his career. He neither sought recognition nor avoided the conversations that naturally followed the administrative review. Whenever someone expressed sympathy for what had happened, Isaiah answered in much the same way. Justice is not measured by how we respond when everything goes well. It is measured by how faithfully we respond when something goes wrong. Those words quietly spread throughout the courthouse, repeated in training sessions, discussed in staff meetings, and remembered by young attorneys beginning their careers. They reflected a philosophy rather than a personal victory. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes had begun rebuilding his life away from the uniform that had once defined his identity. The transition was neither simple nor immediate. Without the daily routine of patrol shifts, he found himself reflecting on decisions he had never questioned before. He reread departmental policies with fresh perspective. He watched his own body camera recording one final time, not because anyone required him to, but because he finally understood that growth begins where excuses end. For the first time in many years, he recognized that confidence without humility could become just as dangerous as ignorance itself. Months later, he attended a community leadership seminar open to former public servants. He did not stand before the audience to defend himself. Instead, he spoke honestly about the importance of slowing down before reaching conclusions, admitting that the hardest mistakes to correct were often the ones created by certainty. Several younger attendees approached him afterward, thanking him for speaking candidly about accountability. Daniel realized that while he could never change the decision he had made outside the courthouse, he could still choose what kind of person he would become because of it. Back inside Judge Brooks's courtroom, another case reached its conclusion. As the final documents were signed and the participants prepared to leave, a young law clerk asked what she believed was a simple question. "Your Honor, after everything that happened, how did you remain so calm?" Isaiah smiled thoughtfully before closing the file in front of him. Because the law is strongest when it does not compete with emotion. It simply waits for the truth to arrive. The clerk quietly wrote those words into her notebook, knowing she would remember them for the rest of her career. Outside, the courthouse continued serving thousands of people seeking fairness, protection, and hope. Some arrived carrying fear. Others arrived carrying confidence. Every one of them deserved to be treated with equal dignity before the law. As Isaiah paused briefly at the courthouse steps before heading home, he looked across the plaza where everything had begun weeks earlier. The place looked ordinary once again, yet he understood something many people never fully appreciate. Justice does not become meaningful because powerful people enforce it. Justice becomes meaningful when powerful people are willing to submit themselves to it. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson any badge, any robe, or any title can ever teach, because real authority is never proven by controlling another person. It is proven by having the character to respect the truth, even when it demands accountability from yourself.